Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, presidents, propaganda, and channeling the media to get the message out. The similarities and differences between Syria today and Iraq 10 years ago. Afghanistan's media are unrecognizable compared to what was happening under the Taliban. But can all those TV stations and newspapers survive post-pullout? Tunisian journalists and their one-day news blackout. And 12 years after 9/11, a new World Trade Center rises over Manhattan. That's our web video of the week. As the crisis in Syria deepens, the diplomatic battle outside the country being fought out in the global media intensifies. Newscasts have chronicled the summit meetings, various bilateral talks, the photo ops that precede the gatherings behind closed doors while waiting for a vote on a UN resolution that would mandate the Assad government to hand over all of its chemical weapons. Both sides in this geopolitical tug-of-war have reached deep into their media arsenals as politicians and their proxies have pushed their particular agendas. Presidents Obama, Putin, and Assad have all, in their own ways, blitzed the cameras. More than a decade after the sales job that was the run-up to the war in Iraq, the question is whether media outlets have learned to look beyond the spin and see the story in Syria for what it really is. A country at war with itself, with more than 100,000 dead, millions displaced, and millions more in peril. Our starting point this week is Damascus, with stops in Washington, Paris, Moscow, and London on a story that's heading for a resolution of some kind at the UN headquarters in New York City.
Syria is a diplomatic battle and a media battle.
The media strategies that we've seen so far are extremely cynical.
You had a media machine whirring out of control, and then you had a generally pretty high level of ignorance in the media themselves.
Binding commitments.
The media battle is as crucial to the war efforts in all directions as the bombs and the bullets.
No matter what the UN inspectors say about chemical weapons in Syria, no matter what the Obama administration says about the need to attack, no matter what punditry is produced on the subject, and no matter how well-intentioned some of the pundits may actually be,
there is no moral equivalence.
The road to Damascus runs through the hell that was Baghdad.
What the inspection showed was there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and the Bush administration decided to go ahead with the war anyway. We have the opposite situation in Syria, where it is absolutely clear now, after the UN report, that there are weapons of mass destruction. But precisely because of the experience of Iraq, it really doesn't matter to people. They just don't want to get into a war.
The U.S. government is widely understood, even by news media flacking for the Bush administration at the time, to have been lying. A lot of people remember that the President of the United States a dozen years ago was saying, hey, trust me.
The Iraqi regime could launch a biological or chemical attack in as little as 45 minutes.
But the net effect is that people do have a bit of memory, despite the Orwellian characteristics of a lot of U.S. news media. And frankly, more and more Americans are tired of being lied into war.
As the various heads of state took to the airwaves along with their foreign ministers to make their respective cases, there was something ironic and anachronistic in the result. That in this age of mass electronic media and great political communicators, like the one in the White House, the masterstroke came from the Kremlin, which effectively schooled the competition when it went old school, through an op-ed piece in the New York Times, written, the byline would have us believe, by Vladimir Putin.
That was really a breakthrough. This was one major move that kind of changed the whole thing. Americans are not used for Russians using America's instruments, like publishing a newspaper article in a leading newspaper. His major argument was, hello guys, we won this war in the middle of the 20th century. We established the Security Council as a way to keep peace on earth. So why are you trying to dismantle it?
Putin's op-ed in the New York Times was perfectly timed, and it also was very deftly written, and it hit a lot of key points of concern to the American people. Now, clearly, Putin is an autocrat. He doesn't seem to care about democracy except to crush it in his own country, and yet his position about Syria and the Middle East in general is far more consistent in terms of international law and standards than what's been coming out of the White House.
And I think the article is spectacularly well written. So at least what we know from now on, President Putin has access to at least one good English language writer. And maybe he should use this power of writing in English more often than he does.
The last few weeks have witnessed a media blitz by various statesmen, each trying to play this game of one-upmanship, each one trying to prove to the international community, to his own constituency, to his own people, that he is more firmly dedicated to humanitarian principles and more firmly dedicated to principle of international law. So we've seen President Obama giving 6 TV interviews in one day.
President Obama had a big problem in the last interview, which was to George Stephanopoulos. He said, you know, with the media in Washington, people judge you on style.
I'm less concerned about style points. I'm much more concerned about getting the policy right. And
if you are direct and clear, even if you're incredibly wrong, the way the George W. Bush administration was going into Iraq, you get high points. If you are right, but people get a little confused, they don't like your style, then Washington resents it. And that's essentially what happened with Obama.
Our soldiers in another area.
President Assad's foray into the battle of the interviews was unusual in that he spoke with the American network PBS and then Fox News. Previously, Assad saved his words for more friendly outlets, Syrian ones he controls, Russian networks he trusts. But he stuck to his script that the rebels are Al-Qaeda in disguise.
80 to 90% of the rebels on the ground, or the terrorists, are Al-Qaeda and their offshoots.
What makes the Assad media machine particularly effective is that it relies on a number of key messages that get repeated over and over and over again. Assad's media machine is controlled centrally from an office within the presidential palace itself. And Assad relies on a cadre of experienced journalists, many of whom have decades of experience. Those people know the inside tricks. They know how the media works in the West, not just in the Arab world. And that's how Bashar al-Assad has been able to, in many ways, manipulate the Western media in his favor.
The Washington-based Project for Excellence in Journalism recently tabulated the coverage of Syria on the U.S. airwaves. It found that by a 2-to-1 margin, pro-war voices outnumbered those opposed. Given that every recent poll shows that most Americans don't want a strike on Syria, the networks are out of step with their audiences. Is that because the journalists are better informed, more affected by the images coming out of Syria? That is possible. What is indisputable, however, is that the last time America went to war in Iraq...
War with Iraq. For continuing coverage of this story, stay with ABC News.
The ratings went through the roof.
Frankly, the top priority of the largest U.S. media outlets is to make a profit. And the top priority for many journalists is to build their careers. Let's keep in mind that major media outlets have a close relationship with the war planners and the war makers. So just because it's coming out of the mouth of a TV anchor who's famous, who's acclaimed, who's blow-dried, getting 7- or 8-figure salaries every year, doesn't mean it's true. Frankly, it's often just laundered lies put out there as true.
Our Global Village voices now on media, geopolitics, and the rhetoric over Syria.
But on the topic of Syrian intervention, people are forcing their governments to listen, and the media battle has become important in a way that it has never been before. When thinking about who is winning this battle, you can't ignore the way in which many of the anti-interventionist voices of the world have begun to echo the position of the Kremlin. And when the liberal voices that I listen to start retweeting, however uncomfortably, Putin's New York Times article with even a shred of endorsement, you feel that one of the most comfortable political binaries is broken down.
Ο πρώτος που καταστρέφεται ή διαστρεβλώνεται όταν χτίζεται ένας πόλεμος είναι η αλήθεια. Πάνω στην κρίση της Συρίας, όπως την ζήσαμε τις τελευταίες εβδομάδες, οι γραμμές κατά την άποψή μου μεταξύ διπλωματικής και μηδιακής μάχης ήταν κοινές, καθώς και οι δύο πλευρές έθεσαν ως στόχο να κερδίσουν τις εντυπώσεις με μια μετριότατη διαλεκτική, η οποία δεν ελάμβανε καθόλου υπόψη της τον σκεπτόμενο πολίτη.
Time now for Listening Post News Bites. In Tunisia, journalists have held a one-day strike to protest press restrictions and the arrests of several media professionals. On September 17th, newspapers, radio stations, even the country's official news agency all imposed a media blackout. Journalists gathered in the capital Tunis to decry what they call attacks on freedom of expression by the ruling Ennahda party. The strike was triggered by the arrest of journalist Ziad El-Henni a few days earlier. El-Henni accused a public prosecutor of fabricating evidence against a cameraman who filmed an egg-throwing attack on a government minister last month. The cameraman, Mourad Meherzi, spent 3 weeks in custody before being bailed. The president of Tunisia's National Union of Journalists, Najiba Amrouni, who called for the strike, said, "We insist on the importance of freedom of expression, but the government insists on putting its hand on the media. The authorities want to turn our media outlets into propaganda mouthpieces to cover up for their failed policies." Prime Minister Ali Larayed was critical of the strike, saying it was political and unrelated to freedom of expression. But this is the latest in a series of issues to hit the Tunisian media. They include the arrests of journalists, allegations of bias in government appointments to state media outlets, and accusations that laws protecting media freedom are not being properly enforced. Vietnam is growing into an increasingly dangerous place to make one's political views known online. A 65-year-old blogger named Ngo Hao is facing 15 years in jail after being charged under Article 79 of Vietnam's Penal Code. It forbids carrying out activities aimed at overthrowing the people's administration. The charges relate to his blog posts between 2008 and 2012, where he expressed support for opposition and religious minority groups. In an interview with Radio Free Asia, his son, Ngo Minh Tam, said of his father, "He has always argued that his activities were not wrong, that the only thing wrong is that they have not been accepted by the government." One reporter unlikely to be working in Pakistan anytime soon is the New York Times' absent bureau chief in Islamabad, Declan Walsh. Walsh had already been bounced out of the country by the government 4 months ago, one day prior to the parliamentary elections there. Now the Muttahida Qawmi movement, a political party based in Karachi, has hit Walsh with a $10 million defamation notice after accusing him of baseless reporting. The party took issue with Walsh's story about its London-based leader, Altaf Hussein. His piece examined various murder investigations against the party and, coincidentally, its heavy-handed approach to journalists. Walsh wrote, "Many journalists who have criticized the party have been beaten or worse, driving most of the news media in Karachi to tread lightly." In June, the Committee to Protect Journalists accused the party of organizing the killing of Wali Khan Babar, a television reporter. Back in May, when the Pakistani authorities deported Walsh, they accused him of undesirable activities that were never revealed. Walsh has not been allowed back in since. In August, President Sharif said he was ordering his Minister of Information to look into Walsh's case. Since then, nothing. Back in the days of the Taliban, Afghanistan's media landscape was barren. Television sets were banned, radio stations were not allowed to play music, and newspapers were forbidden from printing pictures. But since 2001, the country's media sector has been revolutionized. Today, there are more than 400 news outlets there. The explosive growth in media has been largely bankrolled by the West, primarily the U.S. But with Western troops preparing to leave in 2014, international funding for the media will soon be drying up. Can Afghanistan's fledgling economy support its vast new media sector, or will a Western-backed media that is among the most vibrant in the region dwindle, giving way to what critics call warlord TV, the partisan playthings of Afghanistan's political and religious parties? The Listening Post's Meenakshi Ravi now on the future of Afghanistan's media.
Overseas now to Afghanistan, and a stark reminder tonight of the human cost of war.
We want to update you on a breaking story that we're bringing to you out of Afghanistan.
Over a decade of war, the news from Afghanistan has been unrelentingly grim. However, one of the few success stories to come out of the country has been the news business itself. There's been a revolution in Afghanistan's media sector in the past 10 years, and it hasn't happened by accident.
Western governments and institutions realized early on that media could play a significant role in terms of facilitating social change in this country, and also to open up the world to Afghans. The media informs, it entertains, to a large extent allows people to let off steam. People can hold institutions and individuals accountable. It plays the role of many things in a country like this. You know, Western governments may have made a lot of mistakes. Helping the media has been, I think one of the big success stories.
After the Taliban were gone, Afghanistan went through a difficult period. At the Bonn conference in December 2001, an international agreement was signed mandating that the people of Afghanistan must be helped. Support for media outlets was also included. If the international community had not extended financial assistance, then we would have never had the type of media we have today.
Najiba Ayubi does what was unthinkable under the Taliban. She's a woman heading a media network. It's called the Kilid Group. It consists of 3 magazines and 8 radio stations, supported by money from the US and the European Union. When a US-led coalition drove the Taliban out of power in 2001, there were no television channels in Afghanistan, just 1 radio station and a handful of newspapers, all of them under government control. A little more than a decade later, there are nearly 80 television stations, 300 plus newspapers, and another 170 radio outlets.
Donors' role is quite significant in setting up the media sector in Afghanistan. I think one has to pay tribute to their role in setting up such a vibrant, strong media sector in Afghanistan from almost nothing. But there is quite a lot of donor dependency as a result of donor funding in the media market.
USAID is the American government's primary agency for administering civilian foreign aid. According to research carried out by the Center for International Media Assistance, between 2002 and 2011, the agency spent $65 million on Afghanistan's media industry. Hundreds of millions of dollars more were spent by the State Department and the Pentagon. In 2010, the US Embassy in Kabul was allocated another $183 million to spend on new media projects that would, quote, expand media engagement, build communication capacity of the Afghan people and government, and counter extremist voices that recruit, mislead, and exploit, unquote.
All of this begs the question, is international funding for a free press in Afghanistan reserved for those who take their editorial orders from the West?
As someone who has been working in this field in Afghanistan for the past 10 or 11 years, I never sensed from the donors anything that would indicate their influence or their sway in editorial. I did not sense this. If I were to ever do so, then I would never accept funds from that donor.
From where we stand, there have been no demands made as far as our editorial lines are concerned. And to be honest with you, that's something that would be crossing the red line. We wouldn't certainly accept that. But you know, we do share similar aspirations. Our policies to a large extent reflect what the US and others would like to see in Afghanistan. So on those issues, we're on the same wavelength.
Some media outlets received the majority of Western help, while other outlets did not receive any form of assistance. Aid should be given according to the specific policy of each channel. When we at INA TV broadcast about freedom of speech and talk about democracy, the rights of the people, these are things that are accepted in international and Western society. When we talk about things that are accepted in the West here, we must be helped.
Faridun Ilham is the CEO of INA TV, a channel owned by General Dostum, once a notorious warlord who is now a political leader. It's one of a number of warlord TV stations that are run by powerful political and ethnic leaders and used to promote personal agendas. As one Afghan journalist told Foreign Policy magazine, you can't be a self-respecting warlord these days and not have your own television station.
There are certain strongmen who, you know, buy a television station or set one up from scratch. A, maybe because it's a sort of a vanity project, they feel good that they have a television station. B, to defend themselves. They believe that if they ever come under attack from a government institution, from the Attorney General's office, that they could actually defend themselves using this television station.
In Afghanistan, there is poverty and illiteracy. The benefit of having a TV station for political parties and leaders is to put across the aims and policies of their parties to their people through broadcast media.
The stations collectively have about 2% of the market share in the country. So in terms of following and in terms of audience shares, it's not really big. But they do have the ability to incite. So if you remember the burning of the Quran by Terry Jones, the cleric in the US, that was repeatedly broadcast on one of the TV channels in Afghanistan, and it did lead to some violent demonstrations and violent protests.
Opinion is divided over Warlord TV. While many are glad to see battles between warlords relegated to the airwaves, others fear that these channels heighten ethnic and religious tensions in the country. And as the clock ticks down to the planned NATO military pullout and Western media funding subsides, the new independent media outlets could be overtaken by these more partisan players. The future for some of the smaller Western-backed outlets is looking bleak.
Some of these television and radio stations cannot sustain themselves. They shouldn't be able to sustain themselves because they're not managed well enough. They don't try to go and get advertising money. They don't have content that really appeals to people. People don't watch them. So you will see a consolidation. You will see a lot of outlets go to the wall, go bankrupt.
The advertising revenue is very small. The advertising market cannot fund the number of media outlets that have sprung up over the past 10, 11 years. The only other alternative would probably be funding from sources that would want to co-opt media organizations, that would want to manipulate them.
As international troops begin withdrawing from Afghanistan, the ramifications are already being felt in politics, security, and the media. The numerous channels, the newly trained young journalists, the opportunities for free speech are all vulnerable. NATO's war here may be ending soon, but the struggle for domination of Afghanistan's media space has only just begun.
More Global Village voices now on the future of the media in Afghanistan.
The independent media in Afghanistan will not survive without financial support from the international community. The only media that survives post-2014 will be the media that belong to the warlords, power brokers, and sub-government entities, which will not be able to support the democracy, to support the people's voices, and to support the social societies in the country.
Television stations, of course, are increasingly important, but we have to remember that they still are relatively inaccessible for a lot of the population. Newspapers can do some very high-quality journalism. There's been investigations, for example, recently by the newspaper 8 AM into issues like land grabs, which have been really in-depth pieces of work, which have done investigations that other parts of the media don't seem to be able to do.
Finally, this month marked the 12th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, and to commemorate the event, EarthCam, a U.S. tech firm, has released a time-lapse video showing the construction of the new One World Trade Center building in Manhattan. Filming began back in October 2004 when Ground Zero was not much more than a sand pit. We see the rise over what Americans consider hallowed ground of the 104-story skyscraper that is scheduled for completion in early 2014. It's one of those viral videos that's strangely moving. There is plenty of room to criticize American foreign policy post 9/11. However, this time-lapse symbolizes that Americans have a way of bouncing back. With more than 2.2 million hits online, the One World Trade Center time-lapse is our web video of the week. We'll see you next time at The Listening Post.